I'm going to introduce to my friend Carlos Fuentes for digital transformation within our federal government. And in order to do that, I would like to talk a little bit about my friend Carlitos. He doesn't like me to call him Carlitos, though.
I hate that. I feel like I got in trouble.
Okay. Carlos Fuentes, Vice President of Strategy and Architecture at Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Carlos is the Vice President of Strategy and Architecture at Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Wholesale Product Office, overseeing Federal Wire product suite, which enables financial institutions to electronically transfer over $6 trillion a day between over 9,000 institutions. Talk about scale, right? The safekeeping, transfer, and the settlement services for over $200 trillion in securities, and 48% of the world foreign exchange settles on Federal Wire each day. This is the type of leadership that you have in this room today. And this is how we basically look at this HITEC group, right? No matter where we come from, no matter what we do, at the end, we come here to share, we come here to learn. So to provide context, Alan Greenspan, in his book, The Age of Turbulence, said, "We had always thought that if we wanted to cripple the US economy, you would take out the payment system. Banks would be forced to fall back on inefficient physical transfer of money. Business would resort to barter and IOUs. The level of economy activity across the country would drop like a rock." I'll leave you with you guys, Carlos Fuentes, and a magnificent panel here today with Andre, Francisco, and David Morales. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. So I'll do quick introductions, and then we'll dive right into a series of interesting topics regarding digital transformation within our federal government. And we're really fortunate tonight because we have two government CIOs, and we have an industry expert from the consulting sector who focuses on government, and specifically cloud in government. So we have an amazing panel. So I'll do a brief intro of each one. So Francisco is currently the Senior Executive Associate CIO for Client Technology Services within the Office of the Chief Information Officer at the USDA. The Client Technology Services Group provides comprehensive information technology, associated operations, security, technical support services, and enterprise end-user services. David is a former managing director with Health and Public Service, state and local practice. His most recent focus areas include technology advisory services on cloud transformation operations. He has over 30 years of large system integration technology consulting experience. And Andre. Andre serves as the CIO and CTO of the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors and Director, Technology Services Innovation. Prior to this, he served as interim CEO and their COO as well. So it's good to see that he switched to the technology side from the dark side.
Actually, it was a round trip.
It was a round trip? Okay, well, that's good. The neat thing about BBG is it reaches a weekly audience of 278 million people in over 100 countries and 63 languages. So we have a very interesting group today. And what I'd like to do is start out with a question for each of you. So why don't we start out with what does digital transformation mean to you?
So for the BBG, digital transformation is almost a complete redo of our entire mission and charter. Originally, the BBG really was home to broadcasters that you might be familiar with, like Voice of America, that tended to operate after the World War II, mostly in shortwave radio, the old, very fuzzy signal shortwave radios that were, of course, entirely one way. And as time evolved, we went into digital television, and we went into, the web, and we went to mobile. And nowadays, our audience not only receives our broadcasts, but also often contributes to our broadcasts. Because with the digital transformation taking place throughout the world, where everybody has a cell phone and everybody with a cell phone has a camera, and a microphone, effectively what we have is about 5.4 billion citizen journalists that can contribute content at any time, and a lot of them actually do. So when you think about penetrating into a place like China or Korea or Vietnam or Russia, you know that as you're sending information in, that there are people that are more than willing to send you videos, to send you pictures, to send you stories, to send you text, to send you audio of the situation on the ground, as they are subject to all kinds of pressures from an information of the press, freedom of the press standpoint, from a freedom of information standpoint. And so we went from being broadcasters to being in the business of engaging and connecting populations all over the world in a complete new manner and a totally interactive manner.
Francisco?
Sure. So within USDA, our mission basically is food, farms, forests, and families. So we have over 100,000 employees, and you look at that from a government perspective, that's a very big ship. So from the perspective of digital transformation is looking how we can bring the technology and solutions closer to the citizens, really partnering even closer with the program areas where sometimes IT has been kind of at the table, only enabling them when they ask you, as opposed to sitting at the table, partnering with them and say, okay, what can we bring forward for the solutions, not just for them, but to the citizens that we provide services for.
And Dave, from the industry perspective?
Yeah, and so I had a large part of my career on the federal side and until the last year in the state and local side, but many common themes. But as you start to think about the digital transformation, what's digital from an industry and advisor perspective, it's really about enabling the business agility and the mission agility so that whatever the mission is that particular state agency, that particular federal agency can be achieved much faster, much quicker than it has in the past. And when you really think about it, the other focus that I think you see is the transformation to more citizen, customer focus than it is about how their internal processes eventually support the citizen or the customer. So.
Okay. Now, next question is, when the private industry talks about digital transformation, there seems to be a focus on virtual robots and artificial intelligence replacing jobs to drive down costs. We've seen this in Europe with some of the big banks spending billions of dollars to eliminate jobs, and they're getting a 2- or 3-fold return on their investment within 1 to 2 years. Where's this on your roadmap? And when do people with white-collar jobs, people in this room, need to worry, or when do their kids need to worry about losing their jobs? So I'll toss that out to any of you guys. Anybody want to go first?
Sure. So I think it's affecting people with white-collar jobs today. When you look at all of the cloud services that are being offered that we are now taking advantage of, the reality is that by virtue of leveraging cloud services, we're obviating a lot of the administrative jobs that we used to have back in the data center and server administration, network administration, and everything else. For us in the federal government, of course, with all of the restrictions that we have, what that has enabled us to do is to through attrition, manage our workforce so that every time that 3 people retire, we hire 1 back, for example. And so I think that situation is here today, and it should not be underestimated. I think it's going to permeate just about every single profession. Even some of the most highly considered professions where expertise used to be very much at a premium, but at the end of the day is highly dependent on the accumulation and interpretation of data. Let's say, for example, if you are a doctor, the reality is that there's an enormous amount, a general practitioner, for example, the reality is that there's an enormous amount of research being invested into artificial intelligence systems that through telepresence and through digital avatars, or even eventually with in-person avatars, and robots will be able to ask you all the questions that a general practitioner would ask and rifle through what is an amazing amount of data that is actualized and updated on a daily basis with the latest studies and the latest research about drug interactions and everything else, so that 10, 15 years from now, maybe even sooner, each and every one of us is actually going to feel a lot more comfortable going to a telepresence doctor than to a physician who might have been out of school, 15, 20 years, and whose ability to keep up with the 150,000 studies that get published on a weekly basis, is constantly diminishing, right? And so, it doesn't matter what you do. Artificial intelligence is a game changer that will affect just about anybody and everybody. I'm sorry.
Carlos, I'll add something to that. So I mean, we're already starting to use it even with clients, even to within our company in terms of how we have been providing services internally for support. The bots essentially can respond to a particular pattern of questions. So some of that triage that can happen when you're looking for support is typically there. What I see, though, to the core of your question of what's the impact on business and what's the impact on employees, you eventually, as Andre mentioned, there is a ton of data that is now going to be generated through the digital processes that are being implemented as we go through. There's visibility to things that in the past were very manual that you're now going to be able to see. That amount of data, to process it, to be able to make more informed decisions is very hard for us as humans to do it, even in piecemeal. And so if you're able to capture some of the business rules or some of the thinking that you go through to understand that data and then to make some decisions, where I think it now starts to impact so you start giving that, I'll say, insight or high value that you're doing at that point. But if you realize if it's routine, it actually isn't as much of high value. And what will really add the high value is taking that data and then making more informed decisions with that. And that's where I think the evolution for the white-collar worker is going to happen. I mean, you look at companies like Betterment, right, and others that are taking like you mentioned, Carlos, the financial industry and the advice for investing and automating a lot of that. That's based on the data, but the humans are not going away. They're just adding higher value services with that information added to it. So to me, I think yes, it will have some impact for folks who don't look to evolve, and as kind of the last panel that mentioned, once they realize that, if they take the foot to let's move to those next value added services, I think it will evolve. So.
Yeah, I'll just add real quickly on that. I mean, both those perfect answers, and I would agree with everything. It's really about the people embracing the change. At the end of the day, if we even go back just 5 years ago, nobody was thinking about SaaS type, development. They always thought, I'm going to be a Java code developer, and that's what I want to be. Now you've got the Salesforce, ServiceNow, all these platforms where you're no longer coding, now you're configuring. So not to go too much off and change it, but it's very similar. So AI is just the next evolution of that. And so really it's about embracing the change that we're going to have.
Okay, so the next question is, where does encryption fit into all this? And just for some context, a lot of us, work in companies rushing to implement encryption, encrypt more and more stuff. But a lot of the government agencies have issued reports now that say the existing encryption technology has about a 5-year lifespan left because of quantum technology. So quantum computers, those really fast computers, they're starting to break, they have the potential to break encryption as they become more common. A lot of government agencies and financial institutions are worried they won't be able to protect their information anymore. And I'm going to throw this out to any of you, because I know sometimes it can be an uncomfortable question, but so where does encryption fit into your strategy? Because we keep hearing about all these data thefts and all these other wonderful things that happen. And then on top of that, how are you going to keep up with the changes in encryption? So anybody want to volunteer on that one?
I'll just touch on that. When you talk about encryption, you can't talk about that without cybersecurity. And so at the end of the day, cybersecurity, it's paramount. So like you heard in the previous panel, talking about security, that's got to be the first and foremost. So within government, that's why we have things that I know questions that we have or discussions we'll have is on FedRAMP and all these other mandates that we have, regulations, that comes in play with it. That's the only way we can keep up, by partnering with the private sector and saying, okay, with your technologies, can you meet the federal regulations, requirements, all the technologies that we need so that we can move forward? So today, thinking of I'm going to build a data center from a government perspective is not necessarily there anymore. I don't have the time nor the capacity to actually the brick and mortar. You know, all that just comes into play with it. So I know I'm going off a little off in encryption, but that is in front of encryption. Then behind all that is, if we do that, then we can start talking about encryption, whether it's blockchain and other things that come into play as well.
Like to add anything?
So for us, encryption is a very interesting phenomenon for two reasons. One, the BBG is one of the biggest purveyors of software to allow people behind firewalls, like the Chinese Great Firewall of China and the Iranian firewall, to actually access content on the internet, you know, whatever they want to access. And so we provide tools for people behind the firewalls, and those tools have to have not only the ability to penetrate the firewall, but also through several layers of encryption and identity obfuscation, allow these people to do so without being detected by some of the most powerful detecting mechanisms in the world, especially the ones run by the Chinese. So that is great because we're constantly on the leading edge of encryption to allow people to surf the web freely from these restricted environments. On the other side of the equation, we have people that take advantage of our tools to now engage in illicit activities and as a result evade law enforcement throughout the entire world. It creates a very interesting conundrum for us because on one side of the equation you have all of the freedom of information that you want to propagate throughout the entire world and that allow people to actually do things in a safe manner when they're being repressed. And on the other side of the equation you have some of the worst people in the world that are actually trying to destroy civilizations sometimes, and that avail themselves of those tools to actually inflict pain upon all of humanity. So it's a very, very interesting equation and one that we constantly struggle with, and for which I believe there's nobody that has a good answer. On the operational side of the house, it becomes a very big issue. We have a substantial amount of encryption for all of our systems because we transmit to, again, North Korea, China, Russia, Vietnam, Iran, and so on and so forth. Those people do not like the fact that we transmit into those countries because we're providing their people with access to information that they don't necessarily want them to have it. So on a constant basis, they try to penetrate our systems. And without encryption, without very strong encryption, we would be totally and completely exposed. So it is sort of a give and take when it comes to encryption. It's a double-edged sword. But I think it's something that we can't possibly function as a society in an information age without having ever stronger encryption mechanisms that will become more and more integrated with biological aspects because that's just the necessity of individual identification. It will get down to the DNA level without a shadow of a doubt. And that will continually be compromised by more and more powerful systems. I mean, when you can have a telephone with, the equivalent of a Cray system 10 years ago, without the shadow of a doubt, every one of you has that power, right? Then breaking 256-bit encryption, it becomes a matter of time. And so for somebody who's doing it with a big computer, it becomes a matter of minutes. And so that game is going to be constantly cat and mouse and will require more and more double entry encryption and multiple factor authentication and so on and so forth. It's a very, very powerful and scary technology at the same time.
Carlos, I'll add to that. I mean, we look at it, encryption is a part of your total cybersecurity approach. It's about people, governance, access, applications, and sort of where you bundle all the cross-section of all of those. Biometrics will become a big part of it as well because the main goal is of managing secure data is do you have the right access? Is it the right time for you to access it? And is it really you that is accessing this data and you have the authority to see the data? And so all of that becomes a little more personal as your role becomes clearer, as the way you get identified gets clearer. And personalized. The other fact of adversaries will have just as much computing power, if not more, because they're willing to adopt new technologies to try and attack as faster than companies can defend themselves, right? So there's different strategies that could be used, and some that you talk about is how do you segment so that the area that's being attacked and is encrypted is moving around or is piecemeal, right? So it's not a complete picture, it's a small picture. Number two, is it the right place that you're attacking? There's, I'll say there's some federal agencies that are actually using their digital capabilities and the fact that they're built in the cloud to rebuild their environments every day. Because it's easy to do, but it also changes the way that those environments can be attacked. So you think about some of that. It is a constant game. Anybody who's in cybersecurity will have a job for quite a while, I would say that.
Thank God. So Dave fed me a question earlier. You wanted me to ask about blockchain. So I'm going to ask him about, briefly describe a couple sentences what blockchain is and how does it fit into the government's digital transformation? Because we see it, we hear about it in banking, we hear about it with currency. Everybody in the world seems to be playing with blockchain in one way or another, but we don't hear about it much from the GovTech perspective.
So I'll give you, and something that really just popped through my desk about a week and a half ago. I want to say it was Iowa who had just started a blockchain effort. And what they're looking to do is to use blockchain to help them in a number of citizen services, whether it's for voting, whether it's for managing healthcare, for delivering services for payments, for settlement of assets, right? So as titling of assets. And so your question, Carlos, of what is blockchain and what's the simplest way to define it? How many of you have heard of Bitcoin, for example? All right. Do you know that Bitcoin is not blockchain? Okay, most of you, right? Blockchain essentially is a set of information that has been encrypted, but has been connected in the mathematical formulas that are used to generate it, so that a record is created of a portion of a transaction, and there is a connection to the previous transaction and the future transaction. And that record is not maintained in one place. It is distributed throughout the world through a number of what they'll call distributed ledgers that keep track of this. And what it tries to do is essentially maintain non-repudiation, which essentially is you can't negate that application, that transaction happened. And because it's copied in so many places, it's very hard to hack it. But what you're able to do is in that transaction introduce a token or some unique identifier that can represent anything. It can represent money, it can represent units of things, it could represent a title, an identity, a right, a voting right. And those things, when you know that that's been given to someone and that it's been consumed, now you know something happened with that transaction. And you don't need a third party in between to do that, which is another big piece that happens today. Where, a lot of things, when you buy a house, we were talking about mortgages earlier today, eventually there's a third party that validates the money transferred between the two parties, and yes, in fact, now you can say that is your house, and now here is your nice mortgage that comes along with it, right? So that's the kind of thing that blockchain can enable without the third parties, and it does it at lightning speed, minutes instead of hours or days, right? So that's the idea.
Okay, so my next question's for, and thank you. My next question's for Francisco, because earlier you mentioned outsourcing and leveraging the cloud and all these other wonderful things. So we've all heard of Amazon Web Services, but there's this thing called FedRAMP. Can you explain what FedRAMP is? And is it the FedRAMP version of Amazon Web Services? Is it the same as the version people in here use, or is it different?
Sure. So FedRAMP basically it's certification. So for example, AWS. If we as government want to leverage AWS, it has to be through a FedRAMP environment. That means it's gone through testing, it's got certain security controls, and basically it allows government agencies to do it one time. It's not, although some may view it as kind of a hindrance, initially it is. I'll just tell you honestly, I've been through it too many times with Salesforce as an example. We brought them on board, we wanted to use that, but we cannot use the commercial cloud for a lot of things that we just talked about, right? They can't live, those transactions can't live in the space where all other commercial transactions live because of federal requirements. So they have to have a separate government-only space, and there that we can actually work in. So in that area, that's called FedRAMP. So any provider that wants to be wants to work with the government, they need to be FedRAMP certified. And so what that means, when I have my CISO that will then look at it and say, okay, you guys have an ATO, authority to operate, At that point, they can say, yes, you've got all of these controls, you've done all these mitigation steps, and these are all the checks that you're going to do throughout the time. So FedRAMP basically allows people like Amazon or Salesforce, whomever, to actually do that to their environment and be able to go to the agencies and say, okay, guys, we have a FedRAMP environment. You can go play now. And we can do that. The fact that without that, we wouldn't be able to be leveraging Microsoft email. We wouldn't be leveraging AWS or Salesforce or those type of technologies.
Okay, so my next question is for Andre. I'm going to follow up on some of the cyber comments he made. So we've read in the news about North Korea having 200 U.S. companies in their cyber crosshairs. The thought of a nation state going after the private sector is surprising to most people. We always think about nation states, well, with the exception of Sony and a few other ones, but most people assume it won't be their company. But now we're hearing corporations are being targeted. How does this kind of threat influence your digital transformation, and does it hinder it, or what are the complexities it introduces?
So it's funny you mentioned Sony, because when Sony was hacked by the North Koreans, their chairman of the board was in my board of governors. And I tell you that we didn't see him for 2 or 3 meetings, I'll tell you that. He was a very busy man, and he lost a lot of weight during that period. Seriously, it can be incredibly damaging to an organization and to all of its executives, and it makes you feel so powerless. So when I came on board the Broadcasting Board of Governors, every single server in the agency was controlled by the Chinese cyber army. They had total and complete control and could drop the agency with one keystroke, effectively, basically removing our passwords, and it was over. And so that was an interesting proposition. We went through a cleanup process over a 4-month period during which we could not let them know that they were in the system, lest we cause them to act. And so since then, we are subject to attacks on a daily basis by some of these most incredibly sophisticated state-sponsored cyber actors. And so what it requires is an operational discipline with just about every system that you deploy that realizes first and foremost that from the first second that you put it in operation, it's going to be subject to every single attack you can think of, right? All of the documented ones, and unfortunately, in certain cases, even zero-day attacks. So what that means is that you have no room whatsoever to spare in terms of ensuring that all of your systems are completely patched up to date, that all your firewalls are in place, that all your authentication is in place, but also, and almost more importantly, that you have a totally and completely educated workforce in terms of all of the phishing exercises and human engineering schemes that are out there and that get ever more sophisticated on a daily basis, right? Because you can have all of the cybersecurity in the world, and if that phishing attack comes through and one of your administrators falls prey to it, you are in serious trouble in very short order, right? And so it is sort of a holistic approach that you have to take to all of your hardware, all of your software, all of your consulting services, all of your employees, all of your vendors, the FedRAMP certification, it's all encompassing, quite honestly. That is the reason why we have the ATOs, the authority to operate for every system, so that we can make sure before something goes live that you understand all of the risks that are present and that you have the proper mitigations. And of course, there will be circumstances in which you deploy a system that you have not had the ability to fully certify from end to end, because sometimes business requirements just dictate that you do so. But when you do so, at the very least, you have to make sure that you understand what the risks are associated with that, and that those are fully documented and they're accepted across your entire supply chain, your command chain, right? So that people understand, you are asking me to put this system in place because all of a sudden, there's a requirement for leveraging, let's say, a social media new tool that has become extremely popular in Iran and without which you will lose all of the youth population in Iran to the BBC or to Radio France International, and you will lose your audience and you lose your ability to provide impact, right? And if you make the decision that you want to go through that, without going through a 3-month certification of whatever the latest social media platform is in one of these countries, then you accept that risk to do so. But to think that it is not an encompassing pass of everything that you do on a daily basis, It is absolutely ludicrous. And again, the user education is absolutely paramount. Some of the best cybersecurity efforts in the world have been destroyed by one single case of human engineering.
Wow. Sounds scary, doesn't it? Come on. How about from the USDA perspective? Have you been owned by nation states, or how often do you have to scrape them out of your systems, or do you want to pass on that one?
I'll pass this. We're not in a skiff. I won't talk about if that's happened. But, we're vulnerable. I mean, USDA, so when you think of USDA, you probably think of either farms or you may think of meat. But we also have international presence as well. So we have to be very much aware of that. We have the Foreign Ag Service. That is their mission. So we definitely have to be very much aware of what's going on, and we collaborate with the State Department, right? So we're leveraging what they're using as well into our networks. So, as Andre mentioned, we have to be completely vigilant, where we have to know before it even happens. We have to anticipate. So like anybody in law enforcement or military knows, you have to be wrong one time. That means bad guys, only one time do they have to be right. You have to be right every single time. So that's just the issue that we have to keep from the government perspective, just to keep ourselves as safe as we can.
And in your case, are most threats still coming in through email, somebody clicking on a phishing email and it spreads, or?
Absolutely, absolutely. And especially, I kind of put it out there, with political administrations, no matter whose party it is, you get a lot of people that come in from the private sector, young people, they start clicking on everything they get. And so we got to have a phishing, basically we do phishing throughout the year. Basic exercises and training every day of the year. Basically, here's where we're doing, where are we at, making sure that we're doing all the training real time, as well as annual training to refresh folks on phishing, because that is definitely the most vulnerable area.
Have you ever clicked on one of your own guys' phishing emails or exercise?
I have not.
You haven't?
No, they didn't tell me it was happening either. I don't click on anything, so if you guys send me emails,
if I worked for you, I'd target you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a typical thing, right? If you haven't already been doing it in your organizations, the IT organization is specifically sending you phishing messages to see if you click, to see if you go through. And if you report it as it's a phishing email, you get a star, right? But otherwise, right, then it's a training refresher. And it's a big deal because that is a weak point in many companies. So.
Okay, so I'm going to...
And don't use password for password.
Yeah. But 1, 2, 3 is fine.
That's right.
So I'm just keeping an eye on our time. We have 13 minutes left. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So we've covered a lot of different things. We've talked about what you think digital transformation is, the impact on white-collar jobs, FedRAMP, cloud, encryption, blockchain, nation-state threats. Can you share with us what your digital strategy is?
So that's kind of a difficult question, but for one reason. There's really two aspects to my answer. One is, what is our digital strategy when it comes to what our mission is in terms of reaching audiences? And that is basically to be on every single platform that our audiences need us to be in order for them to have access to the information that they deserve and it is being negated to them by their repressive regimes, right? So that's very simple. What it translates into is the fact that we have the widest distribution portfolio of any media company in Western civilization. We run everything from Twitter and the latest social media tool to shortwave radio and everything in between, right? And so that's our digital strategy in terms of facing outwards. In terms of our digital strategy internally, it's basically to absolutely and totally cloud everything that we have. At this particular point in time, I feel fairly certain that the BBG is the federal agency with the highest percentage of clouded applications, period. We were the first adopters of Office 365 in its full glory, I mean, including every single feature. There must be somebody from Microsoft in there.
Is there.
It's like giving me thumbs up.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Was that before or after your systems
I'm
were
not
owned?
endorsing anything because that would be against ethics regulations, but it's just a reality that we did that, right? But we are doing that with absolutely everything. And in our business, that is actually very, very difficult because on a regular basis, I have 500 or 600 people editing high-definition video. And if you know anything about high-definition video and storage systems and networks, that's a heavy burden to put on the cloud. And so we're working very closely with broadcast vendors so that we can do something called proxy editing, so that we're actually editing a little small proxy of the video, and then the metadata edits it on the real version up in the cloud. I believe that the next iteration of our systems, 3 to 5 years from now, will be entirely in the cloud, which means that we will be running our broadcast environment 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away. And I can honestly tell you that 5 years ago, that was science fiction. And I can also tell you that 5 years from now, it will be our reality. And we're sort of driving as fast as we can towards that digital future.
Francisco?
So I'll break it up into the two answers as well. So the first one very much is Andre spoke to, bringing the computing power and digital to the citizens. Internally, it's really, we've got a new secretary, actually, Secretary Perdue, and his focus has really been, and it's helping us from an IT perspective, become data-driven. So when we talk about data analytics and looking at all the different permutations, how that could actually occur, that's actually goes back to an earlier discussion we had. One of the things that people don't think about, data science. That's a whole new realm. That didn't exist even 5 years ago in the true reality of form that it is today. So some of the folks that have done data warehousing, those type of things, they're transforming to become data scientists. So that, from a digital transformation perspective for us, is just one of many big aspects we're doing internally.
What I would add, and this is what we talk to clients, I mean, I think some of the audience has heard in the past, we do an annual technology vision for Accenture, and I want to say 3 years ago, we said every business is a digital business. And what has come of fruition from that is the realization that if you create a foundation of cloud and DevOps capabilities, you now have the agility to support digital processes in new areas that you didn't have before, to analyze that data, to understand what that data means to a process, and more importantly, make decisions, informed decisions around it so that you can improve profitability, improve the responsiveness to your customer, whatever the particular mission that is asking. So the aspect of being a digital business needs some of the foundations of the technologies that we've been talking about. But once you have those, the possibilities are endless, because now you've inspired so many more folks on capabilities that they didn't have before, that they now can take to the processes that they're doing and revisit, invent new ones, provide new services. You heard Fannie Mae talk about 2 new services that didn't exist a year ago, and it's all digitized, right? So,
Okay, so we have a couple rapid-fire questions. Where is the government a leader, a follower, or dinosaur when it comes to digital transformation? And feel free to throw your peers under the bus.
No, I'm going to tell you that, at least from my standpoint, I believe that our agency has become a leader not only inside of the government at large by virtue of our need to leapfrog from where we were behind the government to where we are today, by just clouding everything and just taking the risk of going forward, at light speed on that, but also with all of the other media companies in the world, throughout the world. In our last statistics, we actually bypassed the BBC in terms of global weekly audience because we've increased our presence from 165 million a week to 278 million a week in the last 5 years. And that is because we have embraced any and all platforms, regardless of where they fall in the spectrum, to reach every single person that we can reach that needs our services. And so I think that, as government, we can be leaders, but we just got to be very bold in our approach to things and realize that the biggest risk of all is not taking any risks at all.
Francisco, you can't let him say he's the best. So,
So ironically, I'll say we're in a transformative stage because I will take my hat off to that. Because USDA, as I mentioned, as big as we are, I would say we're a follower looking to become more of a leader, but in pockets. What I mean by that is going to depend upon technology and the space that we're talking about. For things that we work with the farmers, acrecy and things like that, that's where we're looking to become leaders. In other areas where it's not basically our forte, if you will, that's where we're going to look towards other agencies as well and become a follower. So it just depends on which area we're talking about. I would say we're not a leader yet. We're looking to become one, but we'll follow where it's best to follow.
Okay. And Dave, I have a spin on that one.
Okay.
What's the best example of a government agency that's executed on their digital strategy? Because you see a lot more than most of us do.
So
everybody looks at it with their own lens.
I had multiple answers depending on, the top, the sort of the in-between.
Actually, tell us who the dinosaur is. You're probably not going to get them as a client if you do.
No, I can't. It's not a client. But in general, I would say anything that is regulated significantly, whether it's CGIS, HIPAA, NIST, any of particular agencies are very careful to move and adopt cloud technologies or anything digital because the risks are not fully vetted, understood, or at least shaped to control. So you start thinking of some agencies that actually have lives on the line and want to be careful about some of that. So you think some of that. There is some high-end, I actually would say also in the communication side, the FCC, David Frey, a very active cloud-first CIO, and I think he just recently left his position, but his initiatives, and he was really looking, it's an attitude from a leadership standpoint. He was getting the naysayers and instead saying, well, what can we do to address it, right? And when you take that attitude from a leadership standpoint, change can happen. And all of a sudden there was greater adoption that was going on through there. Now, I also think the most recent experiences around state and local, a lot of it is legislation that also holds it back, right? Many of these agencies or these state IT organizations are depending on the legislative arm to enable it through law to allow budgets to move, to allow programs to start that will actually transform. That takes lobbyists and people to understand what is happening. So it's slow, but they're talking. They're all talking. Everybody's sort of getting there.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes for questions. So does anybody have questions?
There's one right there.
Okay, right up
2,
there.
3. All right.
Gotta wait for the mic. Right over there on the right.
Yeah, so it's kind of a three-part question. Well, what would you say is the easiest transition or the hardest transition that you have someone, say, from the private sector going into the government sector? And then the third part is, what do you find most challenging from the government side working with private companies when it comes to technology or security or information or privacy of that matter?
So I'll start on that one. It's almost one answer for all three parts, really. I would say the hardest part is any company or person working with the government is understanding the regulations, the restrictions, the requirements that we have. And then the second one, which my colleagues up here will, I best imagine they will agree with, is budget. So the way government budget works, it's not conducive to technology, right? Technology changes almost on a daily basis, right? We have to write our budgets 2 years out. So I've just completed my budget for 2019. Do I know what technology is going to actually be available in 2019? How many of us know that? And so when that actually comes out, my rules I have to follow is I can't use that money if it's appropriated for anything other than what I said I was going to use it for. So I'm restricted to that. And so from that perspective, you have to be very, not only generic, but you have to be very creative in how you write it because they don't allow you to be generic.
So I was going to say, OPM regulations, the FTR and the FAR, and every other regulation that regulates how business works in the government or doesn't. But actually, I think he's got a point. So I joined my agency in December of 2009. You may recall that there was a continuing resolution in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and that the first budget was passed in 14. It was that two-year budget to 14-15 that the Ryan and the young lady from Washington State, Murray, that agreed on that budget regulation. So what that means is that as a technology leader, the first budget that I actually enjoyed, that I had actually participated in creating, happened 5 years after I got there. And that is just astonishing. So, forward funding, multi-year funding, those are things that we're really going to have to take a look at because the agility is just not there. But then the regulations the FAR is just amazing because, what it introduces into the process is incredible. The agility that it takes away from, even with all of the sort of the nuances with IDIQs and stuff like that, is just tremendously burdensome. And I can't move on a dime when sometimes I need to move on a dime.
I would just add pace and culture is an impact, especially coming from private sector into government.
Okay, we have time for one more question back there.
Well, it's along the same lines of change, and I was going to ask that the panel's been very sober about all how quickly things are changing and the jobs are going to be lost and how things are really going to go in faster directions. And the question really is can the government really change? We're talking about the federal government. We're talking about the IRS. We're talking about the hacking of the U.S. Personnel Agency. So can government change, or is it going to have to really outsource much of its work?
Okay,
Perhaps not the broadcasting side, but certainly all of the other transactional actions.
So I really think it's about leadership, okay? And it is about the willingness to take risks. It is about the willingness to be in there to do a job rather than keep a job. It's the ability to, or the willingness to get in there and speak truth to power and speak truth to the situation at hand, and then map out from a strategic standpoint how you're going to get from point A to point B, right? And be willing to take the risks that say that all of the people that are change averse are immediately going to start to target you. That some of them will think that they will outlast you, right? And that some of them are right, right? And that there is an inherent risk associated with that. But I think it can be done. It is far more difficult than doing it in the private sector, which might mean that we do have to indeed start to rely on a lot more on things like cloud services, where, for example, we're leveraging everybody else's CapEx investment rather than our own, and we transform it into OpEx, which from a budget standpoint gives you a little more flexibility, right? But it also has to come from an understanding in the legislature and the administration and the legislation administration and in the courts that the agility required by modern living, the agility required for being the United States in 2025 is radically different than the agility necessary for being the United States in 2010. And that is a double exponential curve from a progress standpoint, and that everything that is today will not be in 5 years. And so there's got to be a lot of sober realities that need to take place because the status quo is absolutely and completely unsustainable, and we are experiencing the results of that on a daily basis.
I would add one thing, which is you talk about eventually in government, it's leaders that are willing to change and willing to take risks. You eventually, in one way, directly or indirectly, vote in that leadership. Also, the leadership that's coming up is a younger leadership that's looking to and has grown up with some of this change in technology. At some point, it will have an impact because it will demand it.
Just real quickly, because it's an important question. One of the things we have to realize, the way government is set up, it's not set up to change fast. Because if you think about it, administration lasts 4 years. If they're lucky, 8 years, right? No matter which party is in, even if it's the same party that comes back in again, there's change. So from that perspective, we as citizens have to understand we're never going to see the quick change that we see in IT. IT is different. So things that we talked about today, like FedRAMP, understanding FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, all those things are very important so that our partners in the private sector that can navigate towards those type of things then can allow us to work faster. If we don't embrace that, we don't understand that government is set up the way it is, basically on purpose to be slow, and we have to say, okay, technology can't afford to do that, so what can we do to help? So help understanding the FISMA side, understanding the FedRAMP side, all those things that will allow us then to partner and move quicker, and hopefully that budget and everything else catch up.
Hey, thank you, gentlemen. We're out of time.
Thank you very much.